Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. We are going to be handling in this episode John chapter 4, verses 1 through 26. That's the woman of Samaria. I'd like to begin, though, before we start, on the heels of our conversation that we just had, Mike, with Matthew Bates and the book Beyond the Salvation Wars. A video came out done by 4 Southern Baptist Seminary professors, Al Mohler, Tom Schreiner, and 2 others. I believe you can find it. This is how I found it just the other day again. If you type into YouTube, A New Challenge to the Gospel, you'll see that's the title of the conversation. It's an hour and some. And they take to task the book, Beyond the Salvation Wars by Matthew Bates, very, very clearly. I understand that you didn't have the time yet, and you've been extremely busy, so you haven't had the time to listen to it. Is that right?
I've been seeing that it's been going through the rounds on YouTube and on Facebook. I just haven't had the chance to just go through it. I mean, it's over an hour and 10 minutes, and
I know.
My guess was they're ranking his book over the coals.
They are. And so could I just make a few comments, and this might give you a good reason to watch it. I rarely yell at the steering wheel when I'm driving, and a couple of times I did during this one. And it's not as though, again, we are a podcast dedicated to taking a position on, let's say, Reformed theology. I used to be quite Reformed in my thinking. Dr. Mike Heiser was not. So we often had that conversation. But you can be a part of a DCW mindset, and Reformed theology can either be a part of that or not. So I've heard both. But for those of you who may be interested in watching the video, and I'd recommend you do, let me give you my unrehearsed response to their response, and then Mike, you can chime in as you would like as well. Again, realizing this podcast of ours is not done in order to simply respond to issues of theology that may or may not be part of our worldview. But on this one, right, on this one where we just talked to Matthew Bates, and then this response comes out, it has hundreds of thousands of views. I think it would be worth just a few moments of conversation. In my opinion, and again, Mike, I'd like to get your opinion on my opinion, the DCW jury is not out deliberating the issue of faith at this point. We've pretty much settled, I would recommend, that you cannot have pistis, which is translated as faith in the New Testament, without pistos, translated as faithfulness. Again, you cannot have pistis without pistos. That's my understanding of just the lexical issue behind what is faith. I know that's where Dr. Bates would also settle in, that pistis and pistos are not only related lexically, they are related in meaning as well. So that when a person has faith or trust or belief in the Bible, and there's the verb pistuo, by definition, within that word, there comes along, like a trailer hitched, to it, the concept of faithfulness, loyalty, allegiance, fealty, something like that. Okay? Would you agree that from where we're coming from in a DCW podcast, shall we say, the jury's not out, really. We're quite content as a group to talk in terms of loyalty.
I absolutely agree. And I think, and I've mentioned this even several times on our podcasts before. The doctorate program that I'm in, one of the textbooks that we were asked to read for essentially learning how to be better preachers, it actually mentioned that the concept of a mental assent of faith, it started about 50, 60 years ago. Wow. And had essentially dominated and taken over the conversation within evangelicalism proper ever since that time. And that faith used to be understood as having some sense of a loyalty embodied in action component, right? Mm-hmm. Like my faith to my wife is demonstrated by simple things, such as just going back to the same house with her every night, not going to another woman's house. That's embodied. That's my faithfulness. That's my faith to her.
I think you're going to find in that video when you watch it that they really never get to the lexical question. Well, let me bring up another point that I was going to mention, that they start with and they keep harping on the problem that Matt brings upon himself, they say, is that he presents his view as a solution that has been waiting for 2,000 years to come around. Right? It's new. It's solving a problem that has been around for 2,000 years, and they really have trouble with that. May I again recommend an idea to which you can respond, is that just because something is new doesn't make it untrue. Even the Reformation itself, if people are going to be reformed, if you decide to be reformed in your theology, remember that's what happened only 500 years ago. So there was that charge against the reformers. How can you undo 1,000 years of church history by nailing, theses on a wall? And Luther was adamant in saying, I'm not trying to say I'm new. I'm trying to go back to what I believe the text had been saying. So there's going to be that charge in the video. You'll hear it quite a bit. And I just want to defend Dr. Bates. I want to defend ourselves, I guess I could say, in that the idea that faith is faithfulness, or faith is a commitment that is like an allegiance to someone, I don't think is a new idea, as you just said. It's something that used to be part of our language that we lost, even recently, relatively recently, in the English discussion anyway. So I just heard last week that chocolate chip cookies were invented in 1938, in which, the most famous cookie in the world we haven't even had for 100 years. So the idea that something is new can't be true, I categorically reject that. I think we can always improve, and there will be at times in the history of science, math, astronomy, and even theology, there will be times that we kind of look up and say, whoa, we missed this. Let's correct ourselves.
I guess I am curious, like the four theologians, seminarians, were there specialties particularly in biblical studies, like biblical theology,
one was
or systematic philosophical?
Yeah, one was systematic, one was Old Testament, one was New Testament, and then Dr. Moeller, the president.
Interesting. Yeah. Because I find that odd that, because within biblical studies or biblical theology, there's a primacy normally in the way that we conduct ourselves, which is to go into the lexical, into the grammatical, into the historical context first, right? To actually address that. And again, it's as I'm getting ready for my doctorate program coming up pretty soon, one of the books that I'm reading is on topical preaching. And there is this funny kind of aside that the two authors take where they mention, this whole entire fight between expositional preaching versus topical preaching, this is really more of another side effect, or really directly akin to the inner debate between biblical theologians and systematic theologians. Mm-hmm. That both camps are starting from different places, but they do use the scriptures in the end. And like for biblical theologians, we tend to want to start right from the text, move through the text, the context, and then into the subject, the application, how we think it can actually help us in our modern day, versus systematics will start with the topic first, work their way down from a philosophical standpoint, and then get back to the text.
And that would be my last point here to make, in our conversation about this video, that I'll throw to you, and then when you watch the video, we can talk about it later maybe. But what they do in the video, and this is something we all, as you just say, we're tempted to try or start with, is they start with a theology, not the text, but they start with a theology, a story. And from that story, they can't imagine, now I'm quoting them, they can't imagine how someone could put the idea of allegiance behind faith, because in their story, depravity is such a thing to the human nature that there's no way a human can be loyal to God. That's impossible. That's too much works. That would be called works in the Reformed model. So can you have assurance of your salvation? Again, in their story, if you're coming at it theologically, They want assurance as a big part of the salvation story. And of course, Bates would say, and they caught this, that if you're going to talk about allegiance to a deity as a means or a definition even of faith, then now your assurance is based on you and not your deity. To which, again, I would say, well, you're given as much assurance as the Bible says you can have. And I think that's a good conversation to have. But the idea that we would argue from a theological view backwards into the meaning of a word, I found as a problem in the video. So we can let it go for now for time, but thank you, Mike, for letting me at least throw these ideas out. And I recommend everyone to see the video if you want to see a good, well, a reaction to, I wouldn't call it good. I was frustrated, but a reaction to Dr. Bates's book that, again, since we just interviewed him on our podcast, I think a lot of people would find it interesting. Go to YouTube and just type in a new challenge to the gospel.
Ron, can I just at least provide one thought, especially when you mentioned the issue of depravity, right? It's not surprising, I guess, once you said that to me, because I have noticed, like when I was in the midst of my systematic theology courses, Gordon Conwell, it doesn't take a hard stance either way. Reform, not reform, Calvinist, Arminian. I mean, there's always going to be those debates on campus. I was in the Boston campus, and so we were all like nighttime seminarians. And so that was not a conversation that we really had concern with. But what I did notice from the works and the texts that I was reading was that in many ways, it almost seemed like within, especially those who are really loyal to the Reformed camp, is that depravity, in my mind, I pictured this pillar that was essentially immovable.
Right.
That if we budge on this issue of total depravity in any way, like that, even imaginary threats, the whole entire thing could topple down on us. And yet, ironically, it at the same time, a pillar, yes, it supports a structure well, but it does also get in the way of movement, right? And so you then ironically start hitting these unintended consequences and problems, such as questions like, what happened to the unborn if they are never born? What happens to those who have never heard the gospel or never even heard of the name Jesus? What of people like who have mental disabilities, who are that are kind of limited? What about them if they can't make a verbal or mental grasp of I believe in this fact? Then what of those? And so then there are all these different solutions that are created to work around this pillar. And I guess my question is, was this pillar necessary?
In my opinion, it wasn't. And again, it brings back a memory of writing a paper for ETS. Oh, this is 30 years ago on depravity that I was really happy to give. And I was told by my school that I could not give it because it was going against the pillar of one of its doctrines. So I set it aside, and I didn't look at it for some 20 years. And I picked it up a couple years ago and reread it. And I thought, no, I think I was right. But that's a side story unto itself. And, a lot we could say about depravity, but let's move on to, thank you, Mike, to John 4. And this is the famous story of the woman in Samaria that Jesus meets. And I wasn't as prepared when I started studying this to think that this was a DCW topic, but hang on, folks, because when we get into this, it is, to me now, an amazingly technical and historical tie to a DCW. This story of Jesus going through Samaria and meeting a woman at the well and having a conversation about the deity that she worships. So let's get into that. I'm going to be reading from the ESV version and just working our way through the text. I'll start in John 4. Verse 1, now when the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. So there we have this idea again that Jesus is moving disciples of John who were expecting the Messiah into his movement of the Messiah himself. So that would include baptizing people in water just to identify with this new movement. Leaving Judea, Jesus had to And the Greek word does give the sense of he needed to. There's something about Jesus in his mind saying, I want to go through Samaria on the way down to Jerusalem. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour, so about noon. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, and I'm summarizing the text here, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Now again, they would have been uncomfortable moving through Samaritan territory. Normally a Jew or a Jewish company of people would skirt the entire area of Samaria and head east across the Jordan River, the rift there, come down the Transjordan side of modern-day Israel, and then scoot back across the Jordan River, go west into Jerusalem near the city of Jericho. But not in this case. Well, the Samaritan woman said to him, and again, this is recast for us now in our Bibles by someone, I think, I'll say this far later in our conversation about John, I think this story is given to us not just by Jesus telling the writer the story, but Jesus probably was with a couple other people with him, like a beloved disciple. I'm going to recommend this would fit his story, that the beloved disciple would be with Jesus at this point and be able to recast this story for us in the book of John. So he grabs the conversation, the writer does, and lets us know how this goes. And here's a summary. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews, and this would be added, I think, by the writer or the editor, kind of in parenthesis, I believe, in the ESV, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Good evidence that again, this is written to a potentially Gentile audience who needs to be reminded of something that Jews know, and that is that Jews and Samaritans do not normally talk to each other. Now, here's where we have to, hang on to your hats, folks. We have to go back to the Old Testament for this kind of information, and this is classically how a DCW mindset works, right? We hear a statement made in the New Testament, and we realize probably the answer to our question will be an Old Testament story. So what I'd like to do is go back to 2 Kings 17. I'm going to use the Message version of the Old Testament here. This is by Eugene Peterson, who himself was a Hebrew scholar. So I tend to enjoy the Message version of the Bible in the Old Testament. Not that I don't enjoy the New Testament version of what he did, but the Old Testament to me is very well done because Peterson knows Hebrew very, very well. And so he will use phraseology in his translation that sound very modern to us, but they really fit the Hebrew language very well. So I'm going to go back to 2 Kings 17 and settle in. I'd like to start reading in verse 21 because this is the story. It's only here. It's not in Chronicles. It's nowhere else. This is the story of how Samaritans and Jews don't get along. Here's why the woman said to Jesus, "Why are you talking to me?" Okay, so 2 Kings 17, starting in verse 21. Back at that time that God ripped Israel out of their place in the family of David, that's the 10 tribes to the north, they had made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. Jeroboam debauched Israel. He turned them away from serving Yahweh and led them into a life of total sin. The children of Israel went along with all the sins that Jeroboam did, never murmured so much as a word of protest. In the end, Yahweh spoke a final no to Israel and turned his back on them. He had given them fair warning and plenty of time through the preaching of all his servants, the prophets. Then he exiled Israel from her land to Assyria. Now, the date is 722 BC. We know this historically. And that's where they are now. The king of Assyria brought in people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and relocated them in the towns of Samaria, replacing the exiled Israelites. So just to recap where we are in the story, The writer of 2 Kings is telling about what happened in 722 and beyond, up to the point of the editor himself saying, when Israel was exiled out of the northern 10 tribes, when they left Israel and went off to Assyria, what Assyria did was repopulate the land with people from other countries. So they're coming into, usually poor and, the socially outcasts that could move easily, shall we say. They're brought into the top, those 10 tribal areas, and they repopulate the area. Okay? So back to 2 Kings. They moved in as if they owned the place and made themselves at home. When the Assyrians first moved in, Yahweh was just another Elohim to them. They neither honored nor worshipped him. Then Yahweh sent lions among them, and people were mauled and killed. This message was then sent back to the king of Assyria. Quote, the people you brought in to occupy the towns of Samaria don't know what's expected of them from the Elohim of the land. And now he's sent lions, and they're killing people right and left because nobody knows what the Elohim of the land expects of them. The king of Assyria ordered, send back some priests who were taken into exile from there. They can go back and live there and instruct the people in what the Elohim of the land expects of them. By the way, I'm putting the word Elohim in here. Peterson has the word gods or God, but just to be fair to the text. Okay. One of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came back and moved into Bethel. He taught them how to honor and worship Yahweh. But each people that Assyria had settled went ahead anyway, making its own Elohim and setting them up in the neighborhood sex and religion shrines that the citizens of Samaria had left behind, a local custom-made Elohim for each people. For Babylon, and I'm going to butcher some of these pronunciations here, these are the gods that were brought in from these people. For Babylon, Sukkoth-Benoth. For Cutha, Nergal, it's the name of the god. For Hamath, Ashima. For Ava, Nibhaz and Tartak. For Sepharvaim, Adramelech and Anamelech. Okay, so it has right in 2 Kings the names of these gods that were brought into the tribes or to the northern territories. And then continuing, people burned their children in sacrificial offerings to these Elohim. They honored and worshipped Yahweh, but not exclusively. They also appointed all sorts of priests, regardless of qualification, to conduct a variety of rites at the local fertility shrines. They honored and worshipped Yahweh, but they also kept up their devotions to the old Elohim of the places they had come from. And they're still doing it, still worshiping any old Elohim that has nostalgic appeal to them. They really don't worship Yahweh. They don't take seriously what he says regarding how to behave and what to believe, what he revealed to the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. Yahweh had made a covenant with his people and ordered them, quote, don't honor other Elohim, don't worship them, don't serve them, don't offer sacrifices to them. Worship Yahweh, the Elohim who delivered you from Egypt in great and personal power. Reverence and fear him. Worship him, sacrifice to him, and only him. All the things he had written down for you, directing you in what to believe and how to behave. Well, do them for as long as you live, and whatever you do, don't worship other Elohim. And the covenant he made with you, don't forget your part in that, and don't worship other Elohim. Worship Yahweh and Yahweh only. He's the one who will save you from enemy oppression. But they didn't pay attention. They kept doing what they'd always done. As it turned out, all the time these people were putting up a front of worshiping Yahweh. They were at the same time involved with their local idols, and they're still doing it, like father, like son. That's 2 Kings 17, verses 21 to 41. Isn't that beautiful, Mike? How Peterson puts that. It sounds like you're reading the morning newspaper about what happened in Israel, but that's how the text of 2 Kings actually sounds.
I was about to say, it kind of reminds me of a Reader's Digest article.
Yep.
I do have to say, sometimes Peterson gets harped on by folks at times, but there are moments like this that reminds me, like, he is a pretty good translator at times.
Yep.
I've always appreciated like the way that he approached Romans 8, and just even that, like capturing the emotional weight and thrusts that Paul was making in that portion of his letter always grabs me by when Peterson's version comes up. This one is now like second place for me. This is pretty good. It makes it very real, makes it very tangible to understand what the heck is going on.
And so back to our verse, do you see why for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans? 2 Kings 17 is the text to figure out what's going on here. That tells the story of how Samaritans are who they are because of the gods they worshipped besides Yahweh. That's the story being told at the end of our Old Testament chronologically. So the DCW rears its head with this statement made by the writer, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. I'm ready to go on if you are.
Just one interesting thought, because one of the things that are known, for example, like, you've known this too, Ron, about how one of the primary texts that we would often use it when we're comparing like Hebrew and trying to figure out the text. You have the Septuagint, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we also have the Samaritan Pentateuch.
That's coming up. I'm going to talk about that.
Yeah. Yep. And I find it interesting, right? Because for the Samaritans, historically, they prioritize or really only see that the only real scripture was their version of the Pentateuch.
Yeah.
And not any of the prophetic books. And so I do find it kind of interesting to then kind of connect that to what the writers of 2 Kings 17 is pointing out. Because what was the message of the prophets?
Exactly. Yeah, all the time. Good point. Thank you.
That all the time the prophetic message was stop being unfaithful to Yahweh.
To Yahweh. Which they didn't like that anyway. So they didn't have it as part of their canon. You're right. Good point. But I'm going to bring up the Samaritan Pentateuch in short order. So thank you for mentioning that. Let's move on for verse 10. Jesus answered, if you knew, now again, she had just said, why are you talking to me? I'm a woman of Samaria. And Jesus now says this in verse 10, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. That's a double entendre again, this idea of living water, running water, also water that gives life kind of a thing. So keep moving along. 4:11, the woman said to him, and we'll talk again about what Jesus is getting at here in a moment. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living, or in her mind, she was thinking running water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He drank from this well, as did his sons and his livestock. Jesus said, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. Again, be watching for Jesus to use the double entendre and play this out. I do want to ask or just jump on this phrase by her, the woman, when he says, are you greater than our father Jacob? Notice that the woman of Samaria believed that Jesus, a Jew, and her people, the Samaritans, had the same lineage. So again, for sake of a study in this text, we owe it to ourselves to back up and ask that question. Where did the Samaritans come from now as a people? The actual Samaritans, besides 2 Kings 17, which tells the history of the land. Let's talk about the Samaritans, and I'm just going to give some bullet points here. They had a common beginning. The Jews and Samaritans share a family going back to Abraham. So when you think of the history of the Samaritan people, you can say it's the same as the Jewish family through Genesis and so forth, all the way through the kingdoms of Saul, David, and even Solomon. It is after Solomon's death, when Israel split into two kingdoms, in 1 Kings 12, that you have the 10 tribes to the north and the 2 tribes to the south, and the northern tribes put their capital in Samaria. And again, as you know, the Old Testament history, things really go downhill from there. And let's fast forward then to 722. When Assyria conquers the northern tribes, they deport many of the Israelites to other countries, as we read in 2 Kings. Foreign peoples then were resettled back into the land, mixing with the local population, the poor and the outcast, probably the unclean. Here's where we start then the tradition that Jews viewed these people as not only worshiping other deities, which is in itself a huge problem, but also ethnically and religiously unclean. And those things go so closely together that for a person to worship an idol basically now meant that you were a ritually unclean person, and they hardly ever separated those two out. Stop me if you ever want to, Mike, but I'm just going to keep moving through history here that maybe a lot of our listeners know, but it's, again, good to recast here because you can't read this story without understanding it. The bigger problem, and you heard this in 2 Kings, was what we would call syncretistic worship, where, again, this is very pagan, right? The more gods, the better, a pagan would think. If I can look into the heavens and appeal to 10 gods, why not? And yet that's the problem that happened here in the Samaritan city and also the Samaritan region. These resettled peoples worshipped Yahweh and, as the text said, yet served their own gods, and this is the great sin of the exile. So whenever you retell the story of the exile in your mind, and a lot of textbooks will do this, they'll just talk about the sinfulness of Israel. It wasn't just sin, which was a problem, yes, but the sin, the great sin, 2 Kings 17:21, is idolatry. It's giving allegiance to a deity who is not Yahweh.
Yeah, the way that I've often described when people wonder well, what is syncretistic or synchronistic? It's especially in the worship sense. Essentially, it's like a giant buffet. You're picking and choosing aspects from different religions or different faiths, and picking the parts that you like, and it is still a common practice even today, even if we don't realize that a lot of us, even us evangelical Christians, sometimes we do pick and choose the things that we like and just incorporate that into our lives. It's a very consumeristic and very individualistic kind of driven motivation, right? I like these little bits and pieces. I don't think I want to follow the official religion necessarily, but I like, that you guys worship this God. This God seems to have helped me before, or this angel, and I'll worship this angel here. It's a mishmash at times. And so in some sense, what's going on, and even the 2 Kings passage we're reading, that's what's happening, is that, okay, we'll worship Yahweh because we don't want to be eaten by lions. But that's a good, strong motivation. Good. Right. but at the same time, it's not really because we love Yahweh. We barely know this God. Mm-hmm. But we obviously have offended this God because we don't know why we offended this God. So we're just going to do what we can.
It's a good reminder that I think pagan worship was a beautiful thing. It was emotionally charged. They probably had worship songs that rivaled Yahweh's, that if you had been found worshiping these gods, it would have been just as satisfying emotionally, my guess would be, if not more.
And that apparent allegiance to these gods is possible.
Very much so. They have to be alive to be allegiant, shall we say, or to be allegiant to a God, they got to be alive to me. So that's, again, one of the standard points we make here. All right, number 5 in my list of just the bullet points I'm going through historically. When the Jews returned then from Babylon, now you have to fast forward up to 539-ish or so BC, when the southern tribes had gone off to Babylon. When they come back to Israel, they began rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, we recall, and this is in Ezra 4. The Samaritans offered to, quote, help them, but were rejected. And it seems that Ezra, Zerubbabel, and so forth knew that this was going to be a problem, that there's syncretistic worship going on. And so that's why the original builders of Ezra's temple don't want Samaritan help. Okay, so hostility is brewing. Moving forward, and here's where we get into the Samaritan Pentateuch. Mount Gerizim, which is up in Samaria, versus the Jerusalem temple becomes an issue. What happens then, in response to the Samaritans being turned down from helping the Jerusalem temple rebuild, they go up and build their own temple in Mount Gerizim. And this becomes the central theological divide then between Samaritans and Jews. It is the question, where is the true place of worship? Nehemiah and Ezra's reforms, again, are going to be very strong about rejecting Samaritan influence anywhere in their life. So in Ezra 10, he demands divorce from pagan wives. And again, that would include, by context, Samaritans. And Nehemiah will do the same in Nehemiah 13. He will recommend not being intermarried even with Samaritan families. So again, the divide is really showing up at the end of the Old Testament in very practical terms. Then, this is good to remember, and remember when the woman talks to Jesus, she's defending herself. She's not apologetic for her theological stance, and here's why. The Samaritans insisted that they were the true descendants of Israel and guardians of the original law, because in their version of the Pentateuch, we call it today the Samaritan Pentateuch, in Exodus 20, verse 17, and Deuteronomy 27, verse 4, in their Pentateuch, Mount Gerizim is mentioned as the place of the temple, not Mount Ebal at that time. So they actually have a textual difference in the location of their worship, and it's in their text. And that's why the woman saying this to Jesus is simply reciting her own history. It's interesting that outside the Bible, here's where, again, the mental furniture of these people was including books like Enoch and Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon and things. They're not in our Bibles. They're not part of our canon, but people knew about these books. And in Sirach, chapter 50, verses 25 and 26, it labels Samaritans as, quote, not even a people. Whenever you hear that kind of language, that someone isn't, or like they're a nothing, or they're not a people, what they mean is they're heretics, they're foreigners, they're not part of the family structure of Abraham, and thus they are outside the covenant promise of Yahweh. So by the point you come again to Jesus on the ground, their cultures were so diametrically opposed that one would look at the other and say, you're not even a people to me. Josephus, by the way, in the first century, again, he's a historian, a Jewish historian, he accused Samaritans of opportunism, claiming at times Abraham as their father if they wanted to, and then at other times, if the Jews are suffering, it says, this is quoting Josephus, they, Samaritans, deny their kindred to us and profess themselves to be of another nation. So even again, the historian Josephus, a classic Jew of his time period, had no time for Samaritans. So all that in the background. Let me read a quick summary then and see if you agree with my midrash on this too. The split between Jew and Samaritan constituted a long-developed conflict involving family, politics, worship, temple, and even scripture. The antagonism was at full strength when Jesus, quote, needed to go through Samaria. You can see why the disciples were uneasy to meet this woman who by definition was, and I'm going to grab a quotation, Mike, out of Ephesians 2, verse 12. Ephesians 2:11 says, you Gentiles. So I think this is talking about how Jews look at Gentiles, which would include Samaritans. So here's my quote out of Ephesians 2:12. The Samaritans would be, quote, without Messiah, an alien from the commonwealth of Israel, a stranger from the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Those are words that we often put on the non-Christian in modern theology. No, these are words that a Jew would put on a Gentile, including a Samaritan. That's how far away they are from the God of Israel. No hope, without God in the world. They're like children without parents. They're wandering the streets, that kind of feeling. So that's my midrash on Ephesians 2:12. I'm applying it to the Samaritan story. Anything before we move on?
Well, two thoughts. And so first I'll mention, have you ever heard of a scholar named David Mitchell?
I don't recall the name.
He was a guest on Mike Zutter podcast a couple of years ago, and he is a scholar that's up in England, and his focus was on the Psalms. He came out with a couple of works where he talked about the eschatological Messiah prophecies within the book of Psalms, but then he also wrote a book detailing out the whole entire history of this concept of Messiah ben Joseph.
Oh, okay. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it was interesting in his work, he mentioned about how the Samaritans viewed themselves as descendants of Joseph, and that their Messiah was going to be coming from Joseph, from the line of Joseph, essentially. So through Ephraim, through Manasseh, one of them, but probably through Ephraim. And so he brings that up as part of his work and his whole entire kind of trajectory about how Jesus ultimately is both Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David, that he is the perfect unity of the two factions, the North and the South, together. And so he does mention John, and he mentions this particular chapter with the Samaritan woman a couple of times, and just this interesting kind of way that the writer sort of implicitly connects Jesus as though he is identifying himself with the Samaritans to a degree.
Interesting,
that to some sense, yes, I am going to be revealed as Messiah ben Joseph, and also later on as Messiah ben David, because the popular thought was you would have two Messiahs. You would have Messiah ben Joseph appear. He would do some things, and he would die.
This is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, that's part of it too. So he would die, and then eventually Messiah ben David would appear and be the one to resurrect Messiah ben Joseph. And then Messiah ben Joseph's death was going to be such an honoring, an amazing death that his righteous death could cover over the iniquity and the sin of the people completely.
Yeah, I have heard of this. I've never had the time to.
Yeah, David Mitchell's work was great. I mean, it just dove really into the history of it all.
Fascinating.
The other kind of thing that this kind of stirred up in my mind, I've mentioned this guy before a couple of times. His name is George Athos. He wrote a book called Bridging the Testaments. And so he has multiple chapters and sections talking about the Samaritans, Mount Gerizim, and just the history of what is going on, right? Because it's not just simply the religious aspect. There's also the ethnic and political identities that are being at play too. Because technically, even though their worship wasn't pure, it wasn't only Yahweh, for a good 75 something odd-ish years, the Samaritans were Yahwehisks on a very loose definition. And in some sense, when they offered up, hey, why don't we use Mount Gerizim as the official place for the temple? It was because they already had a temple there for about 75 years.
Yeah,
for Mount Gerizim. And so there was this almost.
I want to read it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. And he even brings up about how he thinks there are subtle allusions to this whole entire debate and fight between the returning exiles from the southern tribes into the land of Israel with the Samaritans who have Israelite heritage. And it's coming down to, well, what defines a Jew? What defines a resident of Judea? Yeah. Like who is the true worshiper of Yahweh? And essentially this becomes a fight that gets, spills over into ethnic identity, political identity, religious identity. And I mean, it was a fascinating read. I loved it. Yeah. And I would recommend it.
All to say that, isn't it true that you read Jesus talking to a woman over a well and you find yourself having to spend an afternoon just figuring out what in the world's going on here historically that would have caused this conversation to get put into John. So thank you. All right, moving on. Everyone, Jesus then says, again, this is that double entendre idea. Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. If you get water out of a well or even out of a stream, get ready to be thirsty again. But verse 14, whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Let's jump on that quickly because we, again, as modern evangelicals, here's my call, Mike, we often run right to the finished work of Christ as what we put our faith in. And in that video, by the way, that we started our podcast with, they often talk about the finished work of Christ upon which I place my faith. I find, though, that in the story of Jesus, he often will do this kind of thing. He'll talk not as though, you have to wait until I die and resurrect and ascend to be blessed with something. He often talks as though right in front of you is standing the person who is the solution to your problems, right? So the water that I will give him will become a well springing up to eternal life. Let me ask the question this way. What is the water? If I was standing there, what would be the water that Jesus would give me? What is it standing right there that he could tell me that would give me life? I'm going to grab a verse. I'm going to run up to John 5, which we're going to get there, of course. I'm going to read from verse 20, and I think we can hear in the words that Jesus will say later, or John will record later, an answer to the question of what is the water that Jesus will give even the Samaritan woman. This is from John 5, verse 20. For the Father loves the Son, for as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, we'll talk about that, even so the Son gives life to whom he will, and here we go, for the Father has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Those are shocking words, and I'd recommend that if we could have listened into what the woman and Jesus talk about, the water that he would tell her would include something like this. And notice how this is not dependent upon Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. This is something that he's living out in front of the woman at this very moment. The Father loves the Son. He has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Father just as they honor the Son. I mean, again, that's just amazing idea that if I've grown up believing in Yahweh, and again, both of the Samaritans and the Jews believe they have Yahweh, the real one, right? They are worshiping Yahweh the way they're supposed to. The word, and this kind of gets to your point, Mike, about the two Messiah question and whatever. We're beyond that in Jesus' mind. He's trying to say, listen, everything you have when it comes to the loyalty you show to Yahweh, I want you to show to me. I can't imagine how stunning that would be to have someone, talk like this across a well from me. But I think that's the water he's giving her. And if we could have been a fly on the wall during this conversation, it would have been extending into that sort of conversation. The woman said, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw." Jesus said, "Go call your husband." Again, this is a beautiful story of how Jesus knows what to do and how to draw this woman, shall we say, into further conversation. The woman said, "I have no husband." Jesus said, "You're right. You've had 5. Now, how he knew this, whether, I'm going to go with, I don't know about you, Mike. I'm going to go with his ability to tap into, through the Father and through the Spirit's allowance, shall we say, a divine knowledge that maybe he didn't walk around with all the time. Again, does he know what pi is? 3.1427, whatever? Probably not. Jesus was limited, I think, in various ways. And by God's allowance or the Father's allowance, there were times, I think, when he had divine prescience, and here would be one of them. He says, "Well, I know you've had 5. The one you now have is not your husband." By the way, and I think it's very good to say this has nothing to say about the woman's immorality, presumed or otherwise. Again, a woman probably did not have power over who she was married to at this point. So I don't think this was a slam at the woman's immorality, presumably. It was just saying, go call your husband. And by the way, I know you don't have one. You've had 5. That might not be your mistake or your fault. Do you catch my point? This is not a statement about her immorality at all. This is just a knowledge of her past.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that book that I've been reading on topical preaching, it reminded me that there are actually 2 ways to understand what's going on with the woman, right? The typical Western evangelical perspective is, she was a woman of loose morals or something like that. But from different cultures, especially if you're coming from like maybe an East Asian culture, you would read this and you would actually think, ooh, that's tough. That's rough.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
that means she did not have someone to be the provider, the protector 4 times already. Like something's happened. Constantly, maybe the husbands ran away. Maybe they dropped her like a rock. Who knows? But this woman is vulnerable, and this woman is now, in some sense, ostracized by her own community. And so it's not a pretty situation for her. It's a rough circumstance, right? And it's a different take on that, just because of even just where we as interpreters are coming from in our cultures, we would recognize certain clues just because of that.
Well, I was taught back in my college days that this is the Romans 3:23 moment where he said, for all have sinned and you have too. Here's your sin. You've got 5 husbands, that kind of thing. And that's what you and I are both here rejecting. This is not a call about her sinfulness. This is simply a call of God's or Jesus' knowledge of her past. And I think it means you've had a rough life, haven't you? And I'm so sorry.
It's really just kind of bringing it down to a very personal, visceral level for her of like, I know you don't, but I'm trying to bring out that vulnerability in you.
Right. And that's what she says then in 19. She doesn't take it as a sinful statement. She takes it as here we go. Sir, I perceive you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. They're standing right next to Gerizim, presumably. But you, Jews, say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. So you could recast that as, based again on all that we know of the Jew-Samaritan divide. You could say it this way, that she said, in other words, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you represent, as a Jew, a tradition of worshiping in the Jerusalem temple. Now, let me pause again. This is why I think it's so important to catch, and this gets into my view of atonement and everything, that salvation to them was, whether you're Samaritan or Jew, was a 2-step process. You were loyal to a deity and that's a big and, you went to worship that deity, and you physically went to a place and got atoned, clean, ritually clean, so that you could be in physical proximity to that deity. So there's the 2 steps. I would be loyal to a deity and I would worship that deity. And that's why atonement was such a big thing to them, because the ritual cleansing side is that 2nd step. And to them it was necessary. I mean, yes, if you're a Joseph at the bottom of a well, you're not going to worry about it. But the point is, if you, through your normal course of life, are going to worship a deity, you are going to go to his temple. And so that's why she brings it up. You represent a tradition as a Jew of worshiping down south in Jerusalem. And she saw that as a big problem, that here we can't, shall we say, connect in our worship because we're worshiping the same deity in 2 different locales. Okay. Jesus said to her, here's where, to me, this is just cool. This is one of those moments in the biblical story when there's red exclamation points all in the margins. Like, are we hearing what Jesus is doing at this moment of world history theologically? Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you, and that's plural, so you Samaritans, worship the Father. Let me ask the question this way. Again, it gets into this issue of that 2-step process of worship or faithfulness and worship. What do we mean by when Jesus said, you will not worship Jesus even in Jerusalem? How did he say it? Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. That's quite an amazing statement. So let me, again, do what Paul did. I think Paul's midrashing in Romans 12, 1 and 2, and see if this makes sense. How do you worship Yahweh if you don't live in Jerusalem? I think that was a common question during Paul's ministry. Fast forward to Paul now. When Paul's going out, to the west, and he's proclaiming Yahweh and his son Jesus and how this works now, I think one of the common questions would have been, well, I live in Rome, I live in Ephesus, whatever. How am I supposed to get down to Jerusalem? Because that's where you'd worship the Jewish deity. And here's Romans 12, 1 and 2 in that light. I appeal to you, therefore, and I think Romans was basically a Gentile congregation. Again, it's way out there in Rome. I appeal to you, therefore, Gentile brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, presumably in Rome. That's a bizarre idea, right? I put my body, a living body, on a sacrifice, but I'm 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. Holy and acceptable to God, which is your logikane latrion. In our old King James, it was, which is your reasonable service. The latrion noun is the word for worship. So modern versions, like I think the ESV has, which is your rational worship. Logicon, you can hear the word logic out of that. So I think what he's saying is, I know you're asking in Rome, how do I do the two-step process of being loyal to a deity and then worshiping at his home, his temple, when you can't get to Jerusalem? Here's the answer. Pretend you're doing a sacrifice there in Rome. And by pretend, I mean a living sacrifice, your own body. And you know what? That is your rational means of worship. He continues, verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And I think that point there is that that's how bizarre this idea is, that the renewal of your mind, go back to John 4, when Jesus told the woman of Samaria, you don't have to ever go to a temple again. It doesn't matter, in other words. So renew your mind into thinking or realizing that you can worship Yahweh in Rome. That's what I'm thinking is going on in Romans 12, 1 and 2. It's such a, what Jesus says to the woman is shocking enough. But now Paul is saying this in Ephesus, Rome, Corinth, and all the cities he's visiting, that nobody has to go back to Israel ever again. And I think this is very new news. So, any thoughts before we keep moving?
I think that's a good kind of connection that's going on. It is funny is that, I mean, it's not even like, I'm still out on the jury about whether, every one of the congregations that Paul had ministered to was just purely Gentile. I think there were some
I don't
Jews,
think it's purely, but I just think majority.
Because I think majority I can work with. I think in some sense also this can work for those who are, the Jewish Christians
absolutely.
that were in Rome.
This would be Jews too.
And we know historically there were some problems that happened with Jews that were in Rome that caused the senators and the emperor to not like Jewish folks in Rome in that day and age. I could imagine that it also would apply to them of like, you don't have to come back to Jerusalem. You don't have to worry about plan 6 months ahead how you're going to get over here.
And this is a DCW issue because, again, remember where we're going with is that these gods who have been given power and authority over provinces of the world, Jesus is now what? He's Lord over them. And that means you don't have to go in any certain locale anymore to worship Jesus. He is the Lord over the entire place. So I think that's why a DCW idea can inform, here we go, almost every passage of the Bible. Because now you're realizing that the gospel itself is worshiping a deity, Jesus, who is lording over the gods. And you don't have to go to a house for that. You can stay where you are, put your body on a sacrifice as a living sacrifice. There's a nice midrash. And enjoy Jesus that way.
And it's not even just like just over the gods. It implies and really built into eventually what would be termed as the omnipresence of Yahweh. Because the whole idea was that these little g gods would be taking care of regions, boundaries of land. And so if you're going to worship that particular deity, you have to go to the boundary of the land that this deity owns, right? Mm-hmm. Versus here, you're being implicitly told Jesus, his Father, the Spirit, they own all the land. They're everywhere. You don't have to worry about where you are. You're on their territory.
I think that was so new to them. I just, again, what Jesus is saying in 421 is bizarre enough for this woman. But for Paul then to take this news west, I think was the shock of the book of Acts. All right, verse 22, you Samaritans, this is now Jesus talking. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. Whoa. We Jews worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. Quick point here, that word what. Most every version, I looked it up on BibleGateway.com, which you can ask it to, list 48 different versions of the Bible. And on one verse, and you can see them all lined up. Almost every version, I think it's only two, CEV and one other, has you worship what you do not know. The word what there. So let's quickly grab that. What is that? That's a ha in Greek, ha, relative pronoun neuter singular. Relative pronoun neuter singular, which usually is translated what. It's commonly translated as what, as in Matthew 10:27. what I tell you in the dark, what you hear whispered. John 8:38. So it's in John too. I speak of what I speak of I have seen with my Father, what I have seen of my Father, and you do what you have heard. But the problem is, this is a lexical question. You can ask your Bible software, show me every reference of as a neuter, singular, relative pronoun, and the word who is commonly there. So like 1 John 1:1, was from the beginning, we have heard, who was from the beginning, who we have heard, who we have seen with our eyes, who we have looked upon. We're clearly talking Jesus there, and he uses the relative, neuter, singular pronoun and wants us to think in terms of a who and not a what. Jesus does this in Matthew 19, verse 6. So they are one flesh, a husband and wife, who therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. The who there is again a relative, neuter, singular pronoun. So my point is, you can easily, with lexical confidence, go back to John 4:22 and read it this way. You Samaritans worship whom you do not know. We Jews worship whom, he's using the same relative pronoun, we know, for salvation is from the Jews. So now my question would be, you can see where I'm going with this, who in the world were the Samaritans worshiping? If Jesus can look into this woman's eyes and say, you don't even know who or whom you are worshiping, I wonder what Jesus knew that she didn't know. So I'm just going to read something I've written out for sake of being clear here. During the Maccabean revolt, intertestamental period, the temple on Mount Gerizim, and I had heard this, so I went and studied it. It's fascinating. The temple on Mount Gerizim was rededicated to the Greek god Zeus as part of Antiochus Epiphanes' broader campaign to suppress Jewish religious practices. If you go back to 2 Maccabees, Antiochus orders the temple in Jerusalem to be renamed Olympian Zeus, and the one on Mount Gerizim to be called Zeus Xenios. And here's a quote from 2 Maccabees 6, verse 2. As if it had been dedicated to Zeus, the friend of strangers, in keeping with the hospitality of the people who live there. So 2 Maccabees 6 talks about this as a historical event that up in Jerusalem, or up in Samaria, these Samaritans caved in and they rededicated their Yahweh temple to Zeus. Supporting this, go ahead.
Though at the same time, the reason I think why Zeus was because Antiochus fashioned or likened himself to Zeus.
Oh, his patron deity, maybe, or something like that.
Well, he wanted to say, like, I'm basically Zeus on the earth.
Okay, I've not studied Antiochus's psychosomatic state.
Well, it's funny because that George Athas book mentions this, and that it meant, well, not the particular deity, but that it is part of the royal cult. It was part of the, sort of the negotiation. We surrender to you guys. We don't put up much of a fight. You promise to repair and renovate the temple.
Okay.
And so they did, and they did it in the line of, with a royal renovation that would please a person like Antiochus. So there you go into why it goes into like being dedicated technically to Zeus, because Antiochus was all about Zeus. Huh. He was all about Greek religion and imposing Greek religion.
And let me keep reading. Supporting this, Josephus records, again, here's our Jewish historian. Josephus records that the Samaritans wrote to Antiochus denying they were Jews and claiming instead to be descendants of the Sidonians. They proposed that their temple in Samaria be renamed to honor Zeus Hellenios, a move likely intended to gain political favor and avoid the harsh treatment inflicted on the Jews. This is in Antiquities, Book 12. These accounts show how the Samaritan temple had succumbed to the Seleucid Antiochus' effort to impose Greek religion through the worship of foreign deities. In short, here's my summary idea. When Jesus looked at the woman and said, "You worship whom you do not know," I think here's what maybe she didn't realize. The Samaritans decided to place their loyalty in Zeus when staring down the threat of Greek violence. So now comes the question, who is Zeus? You see how this takes more than an afternoon? My goodness, the rabbit hole of John 4 for me was rather deep. Here's my theory. Again, I'm going to throw it out here, Mike, see what you think. Who is Zeus? And I'm just asking the question going in, does he have an Old Testament connection? Because, these gods are renamed and relocated depending on the locale.
Sure.
Well, here's what I found. In 1 Kings 18, wicked King Ahab introduced the Semitic storm god Baal to the northern 10 tribes of Israel. Very famous story again of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, right? In the Greco-Roman period, Baal was frequently equated with the Greek god Zeus as part of the common tradition in which Greeks identified foreign deities with their own. They love to do this. This syncretism is especially evident in ancient Heliopolis, where Baal, who's also known as Bel or Hadad, was worshipped as Zeus Heliopolitanus, pardon my pronunciation, and where emperors Augustus and Hadrian constructed temples in his honor. Now, that's all in the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, if you look it up that way. Going on, similarly in Syria, the storm deity Hadad, another name for Baal, was identified with Zeus Cassius, sharing attributes of thunder, rain, and fertility. Remember how Baal was a fertility deity in the ancient world. In Palmyra, a Semitic city in Syria, the god Bel, another name for Baal, was equated with both Zeus and the Roman Jupiter, discovered through inscriptions in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. Again, another book going into that. These identifications were not merely linguistic, but were reinforced through, and here's how they thought in that world. You just didn't talk about it. You did it through architecture, icons, which had lightning bolts and bowls as part of their pictures, right? Coinage and ritual, all of which show a deliberate fusion of Greek and Semitic religious elements in the eastern provinces like Israel of the Roman Empire. So here's my theory. Does Zeus have an Old Testament connection? I would say quite likely. I'm 85% on this. Yes. In dedicating their Mount Gerizim temple to Zeus, the Samaritans had rekindled 1 Kings 18, the worship of Baal. Someone who, I think Jesus with a sad wink said, you don't know that, but you are worshiping Baal, the God who really was responsible for the fall of Israel the first time around. So it's a theory. What do you think?
Well, it is. So as you were talking, I opened up my Logos, digging right into the AI, and one of Mike's favorite resources was a book known as DDD, or simply Dictionary of Deities and Demons for folks who don't know. And within the software Logos, I can have it specifically just search within a work like this. And so I asked the question, were the gods Zeus and Baal connected?
Yeah.
And so its response, for drawing from the data just inside that one book, so its synopsis is, while there is no direct connection between Zeus and Baal mentioned in the articles, there are some similarities and historical interactions between these deities. And then it goes on to say, the shift in Zeus's role from an Indo-European god of the bright sky to the Greek master of the sky and storm suggests Near Eastern influence, making him a relative of the weather gods of Syria, for example.
Which is Baal, yeah.
In some cases, Zeus was associated with Baal-like figures, such as Zeus Cassius being linked to Baal Zaphon. During the Hellenistic period, there were instances of syncretism, where Zeus was identified with local deities. For example, in Syria, Palestine, and Phoenicia, the cult of Zeus Olympius was widespread as a Greek interpretation of Baal Shamem. This historical interaction and similarity in domains, sky, storms, kingship, suggests some connection between the concepts of Zeus and Baal, though they remain distinct deities in their respective pantheons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it makes sense if we're talking about the syncretism that's going on, right? There's similarities that are happening. Yeah. And so it's like, well, we have a god that throws lightning bolts supposedly. And then there's another God that we know of in stories in the past with a prophet named Elijah, who was supposed to throw a lightning bolt, but apparently he was busy.
Yep. Well, all to say, thank you, Mike, for doing that. It shows that you're advertising for Logos, and you're advertising for the AI component now that you can get with Logos. And I would recommend to everyone to invest. It's not a huge investment, right? It's a monthly subscription.
Yeah.
Well, it is money. I realize that, but you can do this on your own now, folks. You can ask it questions like this, and it spits out answers within moments. A lot of work.
And the beauty is that it's definitely has helped me find resources and books that I didn't even, because the library in Logos can grow to such an astronomical number. You're just not even sure, like, what do I exactly have in this? And so you can tell the AI, focus on my own library, find these particular books, draw your response from that. And I just simply had it just focus on this one major resource, and it popped this beautiful answer out.
All to say, when Jesus said, I know who I'm worshiping, you don't know who you're worshiping, I think he may have, he certainly is saying something about the lack of information this woman's working with. I think, again, he's not trying to hammer theology on her in the sense of making her feel bad. I think he's trying to open up her eyes, saying there's a lot more going on here than you ever knew. And that's why I'm standing in front of you. Let's continue in verse 23. But the hour is coming, he says, and now is here. Now is here. I think, again, there's another theme here I'm not going to take time with, but we often go to that finished work of Christ as something to put our faith in. I think Jesus walked and talked it. There's nothing new that happens that isn't already true in so many ways when Jesus is standing in front of people. So as he says, the hour is coming and now is here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. I'm not going to take time on that phrase. It does seem to mean you worship him as a spirit, thus truthfully, and that phrase, in spirit and truth, is repeated in a lot of John's material. But I think it has the idea of getting away from a place now, getting away even from the ritualistic side of religion, and simply throwing, this is the beauty of Matthew Bates's point, if you throw your allegiance to the right God, you're in. That's all it takes. It's not a hard concept, but it takes all you have, right? So God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said, I know that Messiah is coming. You get into that question of what they were expecting versus what Jews knew. I know that the Christos, now she actually uses the Aramaic, or we have the Aramaic in our text, Messiah, is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. That's her expectation. He'll be a prophet. Jesus said to her, I'm talking to you, right? I who speak to you am he. He's not apologetic. I don't have a lot of time for a lot of modern authors who make Jesus sound, I'm talking about modern commentators, Christian commentators who talk of Jesus being very hesitant to admit he's the Messiah. That's a common theme in some liberal theologians. I don't sense it, and this would be a good example. When she says, when I get the Messiah, here's what he's going to do, Jesus' response back is, well, that's me. The woman said, or they said to the woman, that's it for our text today. We're going to close up shop now, realizing that in our next podcast, we're going to take the last half of chapter 4, 27 through, 54? So we have to save those verses for our next podcast. But let me just jump to verse 42, because this is, again, what happens, and I want to whet our appetite for the second half of John 4. That's the townsfolk in Samaria, after talking to her and apparently working through this again, they said, we have heard for ourselves. There's that running water, the conversation that Jesus, who he was at this time, not something to be done in the future. And we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. We'll talk about that next time. And again, that phrase, very unique to John, but it's something very powerful. So let's call it a day. We've had plenty of history here. Thanks, everyone, for holding on tight through 2 Kings and through Antiochus Epiphanes and Josephus and the whole story. But You worship whom you do not know. I would cross off that word what there, folks, and put the word who, because he's clearly talking about a deity, and here comes the DCW to our rescue to fill in these kind of gaps. So anything else before we close it up?
No, I think it's a good point to close on the ego in me.
That's back. Let's see, where was that? Yeah, ego eimi. You're right. At the end of 26, Jesus said to her, "Ego eimi." I am. Yeah, fair enough. Touche.
It is just funny sometimes. Like, translators is not an easy task, but sometimes these little hints and winks. Oh, I wish we would just like put that a little bit more clearly in our English translations, just to like kind of put a little splinter in your mind, wondering, well, that's a weird way of translating that.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike, again, for the joy of just dropping things on you spontaneously, and your ability to think on the fly always amazes me. So appreciate it, and we'll hold off on what happens to these townsfolk until next time. So until then, God bless everyone, and we'll talk to you next time.